Alexander Stone prided himself on never being surprised. He had built a billion-dollar empire by staying 3 steps ahead of everyone. But when his new housekeeper accidentally knocked over his coffee mug, the same mug Victoria had given him for their first anniversary, something stirred in his memory. The way she apologized, the way she moved, even the way she avoided his eyes. It couldn't be. Victoria was supposed to be living comfortably with the divorce settlement. She wasn't supposed to be cleaning his house. Before we get to this wonderful story, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the story. Alexander Stone stood in the marble foyer of his Beverly Hills mansion, adjusting his Armani tie as he prepared for another day of board meetings and billion-dollar deals. At 35, he was the youngest tech mogul to grace the cover of Forbes, and his success had come at a price. Everything else in his life had been sacrificed for Stone Technologies. The doorbell chimed, and Alexander checked his Rolex, 8 a.m. sharp. The new housekeeper from Elite Domestic Services was punctual, at least. After his previous housekeeper quit last week, something about his impossible standards, he demanded the agency send someone immediately. He had a crucial presentation tomorrow for the Japanese investors, and his house needed to be spotless. "Mr. Stone?" The voice came from behind him as Margaret, his longtime personal assistant, opened the front door. "Your new housekeeper has arrived." Alexander barely looked up from his phone, where he was reviewing quarterly reports. "Fine. Just show her around and explain the rules. I don't have time for introductions." "Actually, sir," Margaret said hesitantly, "I need to leave for the airport in 5 minutes to pick up the Tokyo delegation. Perhaps you could—" Alexander sighed in irritation. He hated disruptions to his routine. 5 minutes, that's all I have." He turned toward the entrance, still focused on his phone screen, as a figure stepped into the foyer. The woman was wearing simple, well-worn clothes, faded jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore no makeup. She kept her head down, clutching a small bag that presumably contained her cleaning supplies. "You're the new housekeeper," Alexander said, not really looking at her. His tone was businesslike, detached. "I assume the agency explained my requirements." "Yes, sir," the woman replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Complete discretion, minimal interaction, and attention to detail. Something about her voice made him glance up momentarily, but she was looking down at the floor. Good. He preferred staff who knew their place. Alexander continued, walking toward his study. "The house has 12 rooms. I work from home on Tuesdays and Fridays, so you'll need to work around my schedule those days. I don't like to be disturbed." Margaret left a list of specific instructions on the kitchen counter. "Understood," she said, following at a respectful distance. Alexander's study was his sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather, and shelves lined with business journals and awards. On his desk sat his laptop, several file folders, and a simple white coffee mug with faded blue lettering that read, "World's Best Husband." "Coffee," he said, settling behind his desk. "Black, no sugar. The machine is in the kitchen, and be careful, that mug is—" He paused, momentarily lost in thought. Why did he still keep that ridiculous mug? He should have thrown it away 2 years ago with everything else that reminded him of Victoria. The housekeeper nodded and left quietly. Alexander tried to focus on his work, but found himself listening to the soft sounds of her moving around the house. There was something familiar about the way she walked, the gentle pattern of her footsteps on the hardwood floors. He shook his head, annoyed at his own distraction. He was imagining things. 20 minutes later, she returned with his coffee, holding the mug carefully in both hands. As she approached his desk, Alexander was deep in conversation on a conference call with his development team. "No, the user interface needs to be completely intuitive," he was saying, gesturing emphatically with his free hand. "If customers need a manual to figure out how to—" The housekeeper stepped forward to place the mug on his desk, but Alexander's sudden movement startled her. She stumbled slightly, and the mug slipped from her fingers, crashing to the floor and shattering into pieces. Coffee splashed across the hardwood, and the broken ceramic scattered around her feet. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, immediately dropping to her knees to gather the pieces. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. Please forgive me, I'll replace it, I promise." Alexander abruptly ended his call, staring down at the broken mug. That voice. The way she said, "Forgive me," with that slight tremor of panic. The way she immediately took responsibility and tried to fix things. A memory flashed through his mind. Victoria, 5 years ago, breaking a wine glass at their first dinner party and reacting exactly the same way. "Leave it," he said sharply, his voice harsher than he'd intended. But the woman continued frantically picking up pieces, and he could see her hands were shaking. "Please, sir, I'm so clumsy. I'll clean this up right away. I'll buy you a new mug, I promise. I know it must have been expensive." "I said leave it," Alexander snapped, standing abruptly. The woman froze, a piece of ceramic in her palm, and slowly looked up at him for the first time since she'd arrived. The moment their eyes met, Alexander felt the world tilt on its axis. Even without makeup, even with her hair pulled back severely, even wearing clothes that hung loosely on her now thinner frame, there was no mistaking those eyes. Deep brown eyes that had once looked at him with love, with trust, with hope for their future together. Eyes that had filled with tears the day he'd told her their marriage was over. "Victoria," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer and a curse combined. Victoria Matthews. She'd taken back her maiden name after the divorce, felt her blood turn to ice as recognition dawned in Alexander's eyes. She'd known this moment would come eventually. She'd been working in his house for 3 hours, moving through rooms filled with memories, touching furniture they'd once picked out together, walking past photographs from which she'd been carefully erased. She'd hoped the changes in her appearance would buy her more time. The 20 pounds she'd lost from stress and irregular meals, the simple clothes that were all she could afford now, the lack of makeup and styled hair that had once been her signature. But she should have known that eventually Alexander would see through the disguise. He'd always been observant when it came to details that mattered to him. The question was, had she ever mattered to him at all? "Hello, Alexander," she said quietly, rising to her feet and wrapping her arms around herself protectively. Alexander stared at her, his mind racing through 1,000 questions and 1,000 accusations. "What the hell are you doing here? In my house? Pretending to be—" "I'm not pretending to be anything," Victoria said, lifting her chin with a spark of the pride he remembered. "I am a housekeeper. It's my job." "Your job?" Alexander's voice rose in disbelief. "Victoria, you got half of everything in the divorce. The settlement was worth millions. You should be living in Malibu, not cleaning houses." Victoria's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Shows how much you know about your own divorce settlement." Alexander frowned, his business mind automatically shifting into problem-solving mode. He'd left all the divorce details to his lawyers, wanting to finish the whole mess as quickly as possible. He'd assumed they'd given her whatever she asked for. He'd been too angry, too hurt, too eager to move on to pay attention to the specifics. "I don't understand," he said slowly. Victoria bent down and carefully placed the ceramic pieces she'd been holding onto his desk. "Your lawyers were very thorough, Alexander. Very creative. Turns out that when you have the best legal team money can buy, and your ex-wife can only afford a public defender who's handling 30 other cases, things don't exactly work out fairly." Alexander's frown deepened. "What are you talking about? I told them to make sure you were taken care of." "Did you?" Victoria's voice was steady, but he could hear the years of pain underneath. "Because what they actually did was tie up everything in litigation for 18 months. They challenged every asset, claimed I had no right to anything since we'd only been married 2 years. They froze the joint accounts while the case was pending, which meant I couldn't even pay for a decent lawyer to fight back." Alexander's stomach began to twist as the implications hit him. "Victoria." "By the time it was over," she continued, "the legal fees had eaten up most of what I was awarded. What was left barely covered the down payment on a small apartment and a used car. But that wasn't the worst part." She walked over to the window, looking out at the view of Los Angeles spread below them. From up here, the city looked clean and prosperous. She wondered if Alexander ever thought about the people living paycheck to paycheck in the buildings he could see from his mansion. "The worst part," she said softly, "was that during those 18 months of litigation, I found out I was pregnant." Alexander felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Pregnant?" Victoria nodded, not turning around. 8 weeks along when the divorce was finalized. I didn't know until after you'd already moved out, already filed the papers. I was so stressed, so devastated by everything that was happening that I didn't recognize the signs. Why didn't you tell me? Alexander's voice was barely audible. Now, Victoria did turn around, and the look in her eyes was something he'd never seen before, a mixture of hurt and protective fury. Tell you what, Alexander? That the man who'd just informed me I was the biggest mistake of his life was about to become a father. That the husband who'd said I was too emotional, too needy, too much trouble was going to have a child with me. Alexander remembered that fight, their last real conversation before he'd moved out. He'd been working 18-hour days trying to secure funding for a major expansion. Victoria had begged him to come home for dinner, to talk about their problems, to try counseling. He'd exploded at her, saying things he'd regretted the moment they left his mouth. I was angry, he said weakly. I didn't mean. You meant it, Victoria said firmly. And I couldn't bring myself to trap you with news about a baby you didn't want with a woman you didn't love. So what happened? Alexander asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. Victoria's expression softened, and for the first time since he'd recognized her, she smiled. I had Emma. 8 months later, the most beautiful little girl in the world. She's 7 now, and she's smart and funny and kind. She's the best thing that ever happened to me. Alexander felt an odd mix of emotions, wonder, regret, and something that might have been pride. He had a daughter, a 7-year-old daughter he'd never met. Emma, he repeated. You named her Emma, Victoria nodded. After your grandmother. You always said she was the strongest woman you knew. Alexander's throat tightened. His grandmother had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. She'd been his role model, his inspiration, the person who'd taught him that success meant nothing if you didn't have people you loved to share it with. Somehow, in his drive to build his empire, he'd forgotten that lesson. Where is she now? He asked. Victoria's smile faded. At the hospital. She's been there for 3 weeks. Alexander's blood ran cold. The hospital? What's wrong? Congenital heart defect, Victoria said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. It's been manageable up until now with medication and regular checkups. But 3 weeks ago she collapsed at school. The doctors say she needs surgery immediately, a valve replacement. Without it. She didn't finish the sentence, but Alexander understood. His daughter, was facing a life-threatening condition, and he'd known nothing about it. How much? He asked, his business mind automatically jumping to solutions. The surgery, how much does it cost? Victoria looked at him with surprise. Why does that matter? Because I can pay for it. Whatever it costs, I'll... $50,000, Victoria said quietly, not including the recovery time, the follow-up appointments, the medications. Probably closer to $75,000 all told. To Alexander, $75,000 was what he spent on a weekend getaway. It was less than he'd paid for his watch. It was nothing. But looking at Victoria, really looking at her for the first time, he could see what that amount meant to someone living paycheck to paycheck. The weight loss that had made her face more angular, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the clothes that were clean but worn, carefully maintained but clearly secondhand, the way she'd immediately started cleaning up the broken mug, terrified of losing a job that probably paid a fraction of what she needed. You took this job to pay for Emma's surgery, he said, understanding flooding through him. Victoria straightened her shoulders. I've been working 3 jobs, but it's not enough. When Elite Domestic Services said they had a client who paid $3,000 a week for housekeeping, I couldn't afford to say no, even if I'd known it was you. Alexander stared at her, his mind reeling. $3,000 a week sounded generous until you realized it would take her over 6 months to earn enough for the surgery, and from the sound of things, Emma didn't have 6 months. Why didn't you ask me for help? He said. Regardless of what happened between us, she's my daughter. Your daughter? Victoria's voice sharpened. Alexander, you've never even met her. You don't know her favorite color or what makes her laugh or that she's afraid of thunderstorms, but loves roller coasters. You don't know that she asks me why other kids have daddies and she doesn't, or that I've been telling her for 7 years that daddy had to go away for work. Each word hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on building his empire that he'd missed the birth of his child, her first steps, her first words, 7 years of birthdays and Christmas mornings and bedtime stories. I didn't know, he said, the words feeling pathetically inadequate. Because you didn't want to know, Victoria replied. You made it very clear that I was a chapter of your life you wanted to close. Alexander walked over to his desk and sat down heavily in his chair. The broken pieces of the coffee mug were still scattered across the surface, and he picked up one of the larger fragments. World's best husband, he read from the faded lettering. You gave this to me for our first anniversary, he said softly. Victoria nodded. You complained that all your other mugs were too small. You said you needed industrial-strength caffeine to keep up with me. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. You used it every morning for 2 years. Why do I still have it? Alexander asked, more to himself than to her. Maybe for the same reason I still have the necklace you gave me for Christmas, Victoria said. Even when we hate someone, it's hard to let go of the good memories. Alexander looked up at her sharply. I never hated you. No, Victoria challenged. Then what would you call the way you treated me at the end, the way you made me feel like I was nothing more than an inconvenience in your perfectly planned life? Alexander set down the ceramic fragment and rubbed his temples. I was scared, he admitted. Everything was moving so fast with the company, the investors, the expansion, the pressure to succeed. I felt like I was drowning, and you were asking me for things I didn't know how to give. I was asking you to come home for dinner, Victoria said incredulously, to talk to me, to act like we were married instead of roommates who happened to share a bed occasionally. I know, Alexander said quietly. I know I failed you. I failed us. I was so focused on building something that would last that I destroyed the thing that mattered most. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. What happened to you, Alexander? You used to be different. When we first met, you cared about more than just profit margins and market share. Alexander remembered those early days vividly. He'd been 28, just starting Stone Technologies in a shared workspace in downtown LA. Victoria had been working as a marketing coordinator for the company next door, and they'd met in the break room when she'd offered to share her lunch with him after noticing he'd been surviving on vending machine snacks for 3 days straight. She'd been beautiful, yes, but it was her kindness that had captured him. The way she'd remember his coffee order and bring him a cup when she got her own, the way she'd listen to his dreams and fears about the company, offering insights that were surprisingly astute, the way she'd make him laugh when the stress of 18-hour days threatened to overwhelm him. Success changed me, he said finally. The more money I made, the more people wanted things from me. Everyone had their hand out, investors wanting returns, employees wanting raises, charities wanting donations, distant relatives wanting loans. I started to see everything as a transaction. I forgot how to trust that someone might want to be with me just for me. So you pushed me away before I could disappoint you, Victoria said, understanding dawning in her voice. Alexander nodded. It was easier to believe you were after my money than to risk finding out you might actually love me and then lose you anyway. But you did lose me anyway, Victoria pointed out gently. Yes, Alexander said. I lost everything that mattered. They stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of 7 years of misunderstanding and hurt settling between them. Finally, Victoria spoke. I should go, she said. Emma will be wondering where I am. I try to spend every evening with her, reading to her or playing games. The nurses are wonderful, but she needs her mother, Alexander finished. Victoria nodded. I'll understand if you want to find a different housekeeper. This situation is probably too complicated for... No, Alexander said quickly. Don't go. Please, Can I meet her? Emma? Victoria hesitated. Alexander, I don't want her to get confused. She's already dealing with so much with the surgery coming up. If you meet her and then disappear again... I won't disappear, Alexander said firmly. I know I have no right to ask you to trust me after everything I've done. But please, let me try to be the father she deserves. Let me help with the medical bills. This isn't about money, Victoria interrupted. If you want to be part of Emma's life, it has to be because you genuinely want to know her, not because you feel guilty or because you want to fix a problem with your checkbook. Alexander stood up and walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of Victoria. For the first time in years, he looked closely at her face. The years had added tiny lines around her eyes, but they were laugh lines, not frown lines. Despite everything she'd been through, she still had the warm, generous spirit that had first drawn him to her. I want to know her, he said simply. I want to know everything. What she likes for breakfast, what her favorite book is, whether she inherited your laugh or my stubborn streak. I want to know what I've missed and be there for what comes next. Victoria searched his eyes for any sign of insincerity and found none. It won't be easy, she warned. She's been asking questions about her father for years. I've tried to be honest without being hurtful, but she's smart. She knows there's more to the story. What have you told her? That Daddy loved her very much but couldn't be with us, Victoria said. That sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and have to live with the consequences. That love isn't always enough to keep families together. Alexander felt another stab of guilt. She thinks I abandoned her. She thinks you abandoned us, Victoria corrected. Which, to be fair, you did. The truth of that statement hung in the air between them. Alexander had abandoned them, not intentionally perhaps, but through his own fear and selfishness, he'd walked away from the best thing in his life. Let me fix this, he said. Please, let me try to be the man you both deserved me to be 7 years ago. Victoria was quiet for a long time, weighing his words against the years of disappointment and struggle. Finally, she nodded slowly. One chance, she said. One chance to prove you've changed, that you're serious about being in Emma's life. But Alexander, if you hurt her, if you let her down the way you let me down, I will never forgive you. Alexander nodded solemnly. I understand. When can I meet her? Visiting hours start at 2 p.m., Victoria said. The children's wing at Cedars-Sinai, room 314. I'll be there, Alexander promised. Victoria picked up her cleaning supplies and headed toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back. Alexander? The surgery is scheduled for Friday. If you're going to be part of this, I need to know I can count on you. You can count on me, Alexander said. I promise. After Victoria left, Alexander sat alone in his study, surrounded by the broken pieces of his coffee mug and the shattered remnants of the life he thought he'd wanted. For the first time in 7 years, he had a chance to rebuild something that actually mattered. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. Cancel everything for today, he told Margaret. Reschedule the Tokyo meeting, push back the board presentation, clear my calendar for the rest of the week. Sir? Margaret sounded confused. The investors are flying in specifically for... Tell them something came up, a family emergency. And for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Stone put his family first. At exactly 2 p.m., Alexander stood outside, room 314 at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, holding a small gift bag and trying to calm his nerves. He'd faced down hostile takeovers, aggressive competitors, and skeptical investors, but nothing had prepared him for the terror of meeting his 7-year-old daughter for the first time. Through the small window in the door, he could see Victoria sitting beside a hospital bed, reading aloud from a book. The little girl in the bed was propped up on several pillows, connected to various monitors that beeped softly in the background. Emma. Even from a distance, Alexander could see the resemblance. She had Victoria's brown eyes and delicate features, but her hair was darker, like his had been at that age. She was thin, too thin, but her face was animated as she listened to the story, occasionally interrupting to ask questions or make comments that made Victoria laugh. Alexander knocked softly on the door, and Victoria looked up. She said something to Emma, who turned curious eyes toward the door. Victoria rose and opened it part way. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly. Alexander nodded, though his heart was pounding. More sure than I've ever been about anything. Victoria opened the door wider and gestured for him to come in. Emma, sweetheart, I'd like you to meet someone special. Emma studied Alexander with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child. Are you a doctor? She asked. You're dressed like the fancy doctors who only come around when something important is happening. Alexander glanced down at his suit and tie, suddenly wishing he'd thought to dress more casually. No, I'm not a doctor. My name is Alexander. That's a really long name, Emma observed. Do people call you Alex, or Al, or maybe Sandy? Despite his nervousness, Alexander smiled. Most people call me Alexander, but you can call me whatever you'd like. I think I'll call you Alexander, Emma decided solemnly. It sounds important, and Mommy says you're important. Alexander glanced at Victoria, who was watching the interaction with careful attention. Your mommy's very smart, he said. I know, Emma said matter-of-factly. She's the smartest person in the whole world. She knows everything about everything, and she makes the best pancakes, and she never gets scared even when I have to go to the hospital. Alexander felt his chest tighten. Even at 7 years old, Emma was already taking care of her mother emotionally, trying to reassure her that everything would be okay. I brought you something, Alexander said, holding up the gift bag. I hope you like it. Emma's eyes lit up with excitement, but she looked to Victoria for permission before reaching for the bag. Inside was a tablet loaded with e-books, games, and educational apps, along with a set of child-friendly headphones. Wow, Emma breathed, carefully lifting the tablet from the bag. This is amazing. Look, Mommy, it has books and games and… Oh my gosh, is that a drawing program? I thought you might get bored in the hospital, Alexander explained. The man at the store said this has over 1,000 books for kids your age. Emma was already exploring the device with the quick adaptability of a digital native. This is the best present ever. Thank you, Alexander. She looked up at him with such genuine gratitude and excitement that Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. When was the last time someone had been this happy about something he'd done? When had anyone looked at him with such uncomplicated joy? You're very welcome, he managed to say. Over the next hour, Alexander watched Emma demonstrate the various features of the tablet, reading parts of stories aloud and showing him the drawing program. She was clearly intelligent, articulate beyond her years, curious about how things worked, quick to learn new concepts. Are you rich? Emma asked suddenly, with the blunt honesty that only children possess. Emma, Victoria said sharply, that's not a polite question to ask. Oh, it's okay, Alexander said. Yes, Emma, I have a lot of money. Emma considered this information gravely. Mommy says rich people aren't always nice people. But you seem nice. Are you one of the nice rich people? Alexander glanced at Victoria, who was looking distinctly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I try to be, he said carefully. But sometimes people with a lot of money forget what's really important. What's really important? Emma asked. Alexander looked at her sweet, earnest face, and then at Victoria, who was watching him intently. Family, he said. People you love. Making sure the people who matter to you are safe and happy. Emma nodded sagely. That's what Mommy always says too. She says we don't have a lot of money, but we have each other, and that's better than being rich and alone. Out of the mouths of babes, Alexander thought. His 7-year-old daughter had just summed up everything he'd spent his adult life learning the hard way. A nurse came in to check Emma's vital signs and administer medication, so Alexander and Victoria stepped into the hallway. She's incredible, Alexander said, still processing the emotions of the past hour. She's so smart, so articulate, and she's been dealing with this medical condition her whole life? Victoria nodded. She's had regular checkups and medication since she was 2. She's used to hospitals and doctors and procedures. Sometimes I think she handles it better than I do. You've done an amazing job raising her, Alexander said sincerely. She's confident, curious, kind, everything a parent could want in a child. Victoria's expression softened slightly. Thank you. That means a lot. Victoria, about the surgery. The surgery is covered, Victoria said quickly. I've been saving working extra shifts. I have enough. Alexander frowned. You said you needed $75,000. You're working as a housekeeper for $3,000 a week. The math doesn't add up. Victoria looked away uncomfortably. I've been working more than one job. What kind of jobs? It doesn't matter. The point is, I can handle this. I don't need… What kind of jobs, Victoria? Alexander pressed. Victoria sighed. I clean houses during the day, wait tables at a diner 4 nights a week, and do bookkeeping for small businesses on weekends. Plus some freelance marketing work when I can get it. Alexander stared at her in disbelief. You're working 7 days a week? When do you sleep? When do you spend time with Emma? I spend every evening with her, Victoria said defensively. And I sleep when she sleeps. We manage. No wonder you've lost so much weight, Alexander said, studying her more closely. Victoria, you're killing yourself trying to pay for this surgery. What choice do I have? Victoria snapped, her composure finally cracking. She's my daughter, my responsibility. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she gets the medical care she needs. She's my daughter too, Alexander said quietly. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Is she? Because for 7 years I've been the only parent she's had. For 7 years I've been the one holding her hand during blood draws and staying up all night when she has nightmares about the surgery. For 7 years I've been figuring out how to pay for medications and specialist appointments and emergency room visits. You're right, Alexander said. You've been doing everything alone and that's my fault. But I'm here now and I want to help. Let me pay for the surgery. Victoria shook her head. I told you this isn't about money. Then what is it about? 80. It's about proving that you're here for the right reasons, Victoria said. It's about showing Emma that she can depend on you, not just financially, but emotionally. Kids don't need expensive gifts, Alexander. They need consistency. They need to know that the adults in their lives will be there when it matters. Alexander nodded slowly. How do I prove that? You show up, Victoria said simply, every day until the surgery. You be here when she's scared, when she's in pain, when she needs someone to read to her or play games or just sit with her. You prove that you're not going anywhere. And after the surgery? Victoria was quiet for a long time. After the surgery, we figure out what comes next, one day at a time. That evening, Alexander returned to his mansion feeling emotionally drained but strangely hopeful. He'd spent 3 hours at the hospital, reading to Emma, helping her with a puzzle, and listening to her chatter about her favorite TV shows and her best friend at school. For the first time in years, he'd felt genuinely useful, genuinely needed. Not for his money or his connections or his business acumen, but simply for his presence. Emma had fallen asleep holding his hand, and the trust in that simple gesture had moved him more than any business success ever had. The next morning, Alexander called Victoria before going to the hospital. I want to hire you, he said without preamble. You already hired me, Victoria replied, sounding confused. I'm your housekeeper, remember? No, I want to hire you as my marketing consultant. Stone Technologies is launching a new product line next year, and we need someone with experience in consumer marketing. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Finally, Victoria said, Alexander, what are you doing? I'm offering you a job that matches your qualifications and pays what you're worth. The position pays $150,000 a year plus benefits, including full medical coverage for you and Emma. You're offering me a job because you feel guilty about the divorce settlement, Victoria said. I don't want charity. It's not charity, Alexander said firmly. I've looked at your background, Victoria. You have 8 years of marketing experience, including 2 years as a senior coordinator at McKinsey & Associates. You've been underemployed because you needed flexible hours to take care of Emma, not because you lack skills or qualifications. Victoria was quiet, and Alexander could almost hear her thinking. The medical coverage would take effect immediately, he continued. Emma's surgery would be fully covered, including all follow-up care. And when you get tired of playing daddy, Victoria asked, when you decide this was all a mistake and you want us out of your life again, do I lose the job too? Alexander understood her concern, but the question still stung. The job offer is separate from our personal relationship, he said. Whatever happens between us, you'd have a contract guaranteeing your position for at least 2 years. If you perform well, and I have no doubt you will, it could lead to a permanent role with the company. I need to think about it, Victoria said. Of course. But Victoria, the offer stands whether you say yes or no to anything else I might ask you. That afternoon at the hospital, Alexander brought lunch for Victoria, sandwiches from the deli where they'd had their first date years ago. She looked surprised when she opened the bag. You remembered, she said softly. Turkey and avocado with sprouts, no mayo, Alexander said. Some things you don't forget. They ate in comfortable silence while Emma napped, the quiet beeping of monitors the only sound in the room. I've been thinking about your job offer, Victoria said eventually. Alexander looked up hopefully. If I take it, I want you to know it's not because I'm trying to get back together with you or because I think we can recapture what we had, Victoria continued. Those feelings, they're complicated. I need to focus on Emma right now, on getting her through the surgery and helping her recover. I, I understand, Alexander said, though he felt a pang of disappointment. But, Victoria continued, I think you're right about my qualifications. I've been underemployed for years because I put Emma's needs first, and while I don't regret that choice, it has limited my opportunities. If you're serious about this being a legitimate professional opportunity, I am, Alexander said quickly. Completely serious, Victoria nodded. Then yes, I accept. Alexander smiled, feeling a surge of hope. It wasn't a declaration of love or forgiveness, but it was a step forward. It was Victoria agreeing to let him be part of their lives in a meaningful way. There's one more thing, Alexander said. I'd like to be here for the surgery on Friday. In the waiting room, I mean, if that's okay with you. Victoria looked at Emma, who was sleeping peacefully despite the various tubes and wires connected to her small body. She's been asking about you, Victoria admitted. She wants to know if you'll be here when she wakes up. And what did you tell her? I told her I hoped so, Victoria said quietly. Friday morning arrived gray and overcast with the kind of persistent drizzle that made Los Angeles feel melancholy. Alexander arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m. carrying coffee for Victoria and a small stuffed animal for Emma, a brown bear wearing a t-shirt that said "Brave." Emma was already awake when he entered the room, sitting up in bed and looking nervous for the first time since he'd met her. Hi, Alexander, she said, her voice smaller than usual. Mommy says I have to have surgery today. That's right, Alexander said, sitting down in the chair beside her bed. How are you feeling about that? Emma considered the question seriously. Scared, she admitted, but also excited because after the surgery, my heart will work better and I won't get tired so easily. Mommy says I might even be able to play soccer like the other kids. Alexander glanced at Victoria, who was trying to hide her own nervousness behind a bright smile. Soccer sounds like fun, he said. Will you teach me? Emma asked suddenly. After I get better? Mommy doesn't know how to play soccer. Alexander felt his chest tighten with emotion. I would love to teach you soccer, he said. I played in college. Really? Were you good? I was okay, Alexander said modestly, though he'd actually been quite good. But I bet you'll be even better. A nurse came in to prepare Emma for surgery, explaining the procedure in child-friendly terms and giving her a mild sedative to help her relax. As Emma became drowsy, she reached out for both Alexander and Victoria. Promise you'll be here when I wake up, she said, her words slightly slurred from the medication. I promise, Victoria said, kissing her forehead. Both of you, Emma insisted, looking at Alexander with droopy eyes. Both of us, Alexander confirmed, taking her small hand in his. We'll be right here waiting for you. Emma smiled and closed her eyes as the nurses prepared to take her to the operating room. Before they wheeled her bed out, she opened her eyes one more time and looked directly at Alexander. Daddy? She said softly. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. It was the first time she'd called him that, and the word hit him like a physical blow. Yes, sweetheart? I'm glad you came back. Alexander couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just squeezed her hand gently. As the nurses wheeled Emma away, he and Victoria were left alone in the suddenly empty room. Victoria immediately began crying, not the quiet tears she'd been holding back all morning, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from her very soul. Without thinking, Alexander pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face against his chest. She called you Daddy, Victoria said between sobs. I didn't tell her to. I never said. She just knew. Alexander held her tighter, his own eyes filling with tears. She's going to be fine, he whispered into her hair. The doctor said this procedure has a 98% success rate. She's going to be fine. They held each other in the empty hospital room, two people who had once loved each other deeply, united now by their love for the child they'd created together. For the first time in 7 years, Alexander felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The surgery took 4 hours. Alexander and Victoria waited in the family lounge, making awkward conversation with other parents and relatives, drinking bad coffee, and pretending to read magazines they weren't actually seeing. Finally, Dr. Sarah Chen, Emma's surgeon, appeared in the doorway, still wearing her surgical scrubs. Mr. and Mrs. Matthews? she said, looking between Alexander and Victoria. How is she? Victoria asked, standing up quickly. Dr. Chen smiled. The surgery was a complete success. We replaced the faulty valve and Emma's heart function looks excellent. She's a strong little girl. Victoria sank back into her chair with relief, tears streaming down her face. Alexander felt his knees go weak with the release of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. When can we see her? Alexander asked. She's in recovery now, Dr. Chen explained. She should be awake in about an hour. The next few days will be crucial for monitoring, but I expect a full recovery. With proper care and regular checkups, she should be able to live a completely normal life. After Dr. Chen left, Alexander and Victoria sat in silence for several minutes, processing the good news. She's okay, Victoria said finally, as if she couldn't quite believe it. She's okay, Alexander confirmed. Victoria looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For being here. For keeping your promise to her. For ... Victoria struggled to find the words. For caring about her the way a father should. Alexander reached over and took her hand. Victoria, I want to be her father, not just financially, not just when it's convenient, but really be her father. I want to take her to school and help with homework and teach her to drive and scare away boys when she's older. Victoria laughed through her tears. She's 7 years old. I think we have a few years before we need to worry about boys. I also want to try again with us, Alexander said quietly. I know I have no right to ask after everything I put you through, but Victoria, I never stopped loving you, not even when I was too stubborn and scared to admit it. Victoria pulled her hand away gently. Alexander, that's not fair. You can't use our daughter's medical crisis as an excuse to... I'm not using anything as an excuse, Alexander interrupted. I'm telling you that spending this week with you and Emma has reminded me of everything I lost when I let my fear and pride destroy our marriage. I'm asking if there's any chance you might be willing to give us another try. Victoria was quiet for a long time, studying his face. You hurt me, she said finally. You made me feel like I wasn't worth fighting for, like our marriage was just an inconvenience you wanted to get rid of. I know, Alexander said, and I'm sorrier than I can ever express. But people change, Victoria. I've changed. These past 7 years of success mean nothing compared to one afternoon of reading stories to Emma. This week has shown me what I should have realized years ago, that you and Emma are the best things that ever happened to me. Victoria stood up and walked over to the window overlooking the hospital's garden. What about your company? Your 18-hour days? Your need to control everything? I'll hire a COO to handle day-to-day operations, Alexander said immediately. I'll restructure my responsibilities so I can be home for dinner every night and weekends. I'll prove to you that you and Emma come first, always. And what if we try again and it doesn't work? Victoria asked, not turning around. What happens to Emma then? She's already starting to care about you. If you disappear from her life again... I won't disappear, Alexander said firmly. Even if you decide you can't forgive me, I'll always be Emma's father. That doesn't change regardless of what happens between us. Victoria turned around to face him. I'm not ready to make any big decisions right now, she said. Emma needs to recover. She needs stability. I need to focus on helping her heal. Alexander nodded, trying not to let his disappointment show. I understand. But, Victoria continued, I'm not saying no. I'm saying, let's see what happens. Let's focus on Emma for now and see how we all adjust to this new reality. It wasn't the declaration of love Alexander had hoped for, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a chance, and that was more than he'd dared to hope for a week ago. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. and Mrs. Matthews, Emma is awake and asking for you. They followed the nurse to the recovery room, where Emma was lying propped up in bed, looking pale but alert. Her face lit up when she saw them both walk in together. Daddy, she said, reaching out her arms. Mommy, you're both here. Alexander's heart swelled at hearing her call him Daddy again. He leaned down to kiss her forehead gently. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Tired, Emma admitted, and my chest hurts a little. But Dr. Chen says my heart is all better now. That's right, Victoria said, taking Emma's hand. You're going to feel much better once you heal. Emma looked back and forth between her parents. "Are we going to be a real family now?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. Alexander and Victoria exchanged a look over Emma's head. "We're going to try, sweetheart," Victoria said carefully. "Daddy's going to be spending a lot more time with us." "Good," Emma said decisively. "I like having a daddy." Over the next few days, Alexander barely left the hospital. He brought Victoria meals, read to Emma, played games, and helped with the small tasks that make long hospital stays bearable. He watched Victoria's natural grace as a mother, the way she anticipated Emma's needs and provided comfort with a touch or a word. He also saw Emma's resilience and humor, the way she made friends with the nurses and entertained other young patients with stories and drawings on her new tablet. She was definitely his daughter, determined, optimistic, and possessing a natural leadership quality that drew people to her. On Tuesday, Dr. Chen cleared Emma to go home, with instructions for rest and follow-up appointments. "Where is home?" Emma asked as they prepared to leave the hospital. Alexander and Victoria hadn't discussed living arrangements, and the question caught them both off guard. "Well," Victoria said slowly, "we still have our apartment." "But Daddy has that big house," Emma pointed out logically, "and he has that huge TV and the swimming pool. Can we stay there while I get better?" Alexander looked at Victoria hopefully. "There's plenty of space," he said. "Emma could have her own room, you could have your privacy, and I could help with her recovery." Victoria hesitated. Moving into Alexander's house felt like a big step, one she wasn't sure she was ready for. "Please, Mommy," Emma said, "I want to stay with Daddy." Victoria found herself unable to resist her daughter's request, especially when Emma was still recovering from major surgery. "Okay," she said finally, "just until you're feeling better." Alexander's smile could have lit up the entire hospital. Moving back into Alexander's house was surreal for Victoria. Everything was exactly as she remembered it, yet completely different. The rooms held memories of their marriage, but now Emma's laughter and chatter filled the spaces that had once been silent and formal. Alexander had converted his home office into a temporary bedroom for Emma, complete with a hospital bed, medical equipment, and more toys and books than any 7-year-old could possibly need. Victoria stayed in the guest suite down the hall, maintaining the physical distance that felt emotionally necessary. For 2 weeks, they settled into a routine. Alexander worked from home, managing his business via video conferences and phone calls while remaining available to help with Emma's care. Victoria focused on Emma's recovery while starting her new position at Stone Technologies remotely. Emma thrived with the attention from both parents. Her color improved daily, and her energy levels slowly returned. She delighted in having Alexander help with her physical therapy exercises and teaching him to play the video games on her tablet. "You're terrible at this, Daddy," she announced one afternoon as Alexander struggled with a puzzle game. "Even Mommy is better than you, and she's old." "Thanks a lot," Victoria said dryly from where she sat working on her laptop nearby. "Not old," Emma clarified quickly. "Just older than me." Alexander laughed. "I think I've been insulted by both my girls." Victoria felt a flutter in her chest at his casual use of "my girls," but she tried to ignore it. They were taking things slowly, focusing on Emma, not making any big decisions about their relationship. But as the days passed, Victoria found herself remembering why she'd fallen in love with Alexander in the first place. He was patient with Emma, creative in finding ways to keep her entertained during her recovery. He listened when Victoria talked about work or Emma's needs. He was present in a way he'd never been during their marriage. One evening, after Emma had gone to sleep, Victoria found Alexander sitting by the pool, staring up at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, sitting down in the chair next to him. "I was thinking about what Emma asked at the hospital," Alexander said, "about being a real family." Victoria felt her heart speed up. And I realized I don't actually know how to be part of a family," Alexander admitted. "My parents died when I was young. My grandmother raised me, but she was very practical, not emotional. I've spent my entire adult life focused on individual achievement. I don't know how to put other people first, how to make decisions based on what's best for everyone instead of just what's most efficient or profitable." Victoria considered his words. "You've been putting Emma first for 2 weeks." "That's different," Alexander said. "She's recovering from surgery. Of course she comes first. But what about when life goes back to normal? What happens when I have a crucial business meeting the same day as Emma's school play? What if you want to go back to school or change careers and it disrupts my schedule? You figure it out, Victoria said simply. That's what families do. You compromise, you adjust, you make sacrifices for each other because the relationship is worth more than any individual inconvenience. Alexander turned to look at her. Is that why you divorced me? Because I wasn't willing to make those sacrifices? Victoria was quiet for a moment. Partly, she said honestly, but also because you never talked to me about these kinds of conflicts. You just made unilateral decisions and expected me to adapt. A partnership requires communication, Alexander. It requires trusting the other person enough to share your concerns and work together on solutions. I'm learning, Alexander said. These 2 weeks with you and Emma, I've never been happier. Even when Emma was sick, even when I was scared about the surgery, I felt more fulfilled than I have in years. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. Alexander, I love you, he said simply. I love both of you. I know I have a lot to prove, and I know trust takes time to rebuild, but I want to try. I want us to try. Victoria looked at him sitting there in the moonlight, vulnerable and hopeful, and felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. I love you too, she admitted. I never stopped. But love wasn't enough the first time, Alexander. How do I know it will be enough now? Because this time I know what I'm fighting for, Alexander said. This time, I understand what I'd be losing if I let work come between us again. Victoria was quiet for a long time, weighing her heart against her head, her hopes against her fears. One condition, she said finally. Alexander leaned forward eagerly. Anything. We do this slowly. Emma comes first, always. We don't move in together officially until she's fully recovered and adjusted to having you in her life. We don't make any big changes until we're all sure this is what we want. Alexander nodded. Agreed. What else? Counseling, Victoria said. Both couples counseling and family therapy to help Emma adjust. We do this right this time, with professional help to navigate the complicated parts. Agreed, Alexander said immediately. Anything else? Victoria smiled for the first time since the conversation began. You have to let me beat you at Emma's video games occasionally. Your ego can handle losing to a 7-year-old. Alexander laughed and reached over to take her hand. I think my ego can survive that. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the kitchen of the house he now shared with Victoria and Emma, making pancakes on a Saturday morning. Emma sat at the kitchen island, regaling him with detailed plans for her upcoming soccer season. Ha! And Coach Williams says I have natural ability, Emma was saying, gesticulating with her fork. She thinks I could be really good if I practice hard. Will you come to all my games, Daddy? Every single one, Alexander promised, flipping a pancake with perhaps more flair than necessary. I already blocked the time in my calendar. Victoria walked into the kitchen wearing jeans and one of Alexander's old t-shirts, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked younger than she had in years, relaxed and genuinely happy. How are my favorite people this morning? She asked, kissing Emma on the top of her head and then giving Alexander a quick kiss. Daddy's making funny-shaped pancakes, Emma reported. That one looks like a giraffe and that one looks like… I don't know what that looks like. That one looks like an attempt, Victoria said diplomatically, examining Alexander's culinary efforts with amusement. Hey, Alexander protested. I've gotten much better at this cooking thing. You have, Victoria agreed. Remember the first time you tried to make grilled cheese and set off the smoke alarm? Emma giggled. And the fire department came and everything. Alexander groaned at the memory. I prefer to think of that as a learning experience. As they sat down to breakfast together, Alexander looked around the table at his family and felt a contentment he'd never experienced in all his years of business success. Emma chattered about school and friends, Victoria talked about a new marketing campaign she was developing, and Alexander contributed his own stories about the day ahead. After breakfast, while Emma was getting ready for her soccer game, Victoria and Alexander cleaned up the kitchen together. Happy? Victoria asked, bumping his shoulder playfully as they worked side by side. Incredibly, Alexander said. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that you gave me another chance, that Emma accepts me as her dad, that we're actually making this work. We are making it work, Victoria agreed. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. Alexander put down the dish he was drying and turned to face Victoria fully. There's something I want to ask you. Victoria raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Victoria's eyes widened as he dropped to one knee in their kitchen, surrounded by breakfast dishes and the comfortable chaos of family life. Victoria Matthews, he said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. 7 years ago, I was too stupid and scared to fight for what we had. I let my fear destroy the best thing in my life, and I've regretted it every day since. Victoria's hands flew to her mouth, tears already starting to fall. These past 6 months have been the best of my life, Alexander continued, not because everything has been perfect, but because we've built something real together. We've learned how to communicate, how to compromise, how to put our family first. We've created a home filled with love and laughter and the kind of happiness I never thought I deserved. Alexander, Victoria whispered. I love you, Alexander said simply. I love Emma. I love the life we've built together. I want to make it official. I want to marry you again, but this time for all the right reasons. This time as a man who knows that success means nothing without someone to share it with. He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring, different from the elaborate engagement ring he'd given her years ago, more suited to the woman she'd become and the life they were building together. Will you marry me? He asked. Will you let me be your husband and Emma's stepfather officially? Will you take a chance on us one more time? Victoria was crying too hard to speak, but she nodded emphatically and held out her trembling hand. Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and stood up, pulling her into his arms. Is that a yes? He asked, kissing away her tears. That's a yes, Victoria managed to say through her sobs. That's a definitely, absolutely, completely yes. What's all the crying about? Emma asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway in her soccer uniform. Alexander and Victoria broke apart, both grinning through their tears. Daddy asked me to marry him, Victoria explained. Emma's face lit up with excitement. Really? Does that mean we get to have a wedding? With a big cake and a pretty dress and dancing? If that's what you want, Alexander said, scooping Emma up in his arms. I want everything, Emma declared. A big wedding with all our friends, and I want to be in it, and I want to throw flowers, and I want a fancy dress. Alexander and Victoria looked at each other over Emma's head, both thinking the same thing. Their first wedding had been about impressing other people, about status and appearance. This one would be about celebrating the family they'd created and the love they'd fought to rebuild. Then that's exactly what we'll have, Victoria said, kissing both Emma and Alexander. The most beautiful family wedding anyone has ever seen. 1 year later, on a perfect spring day in Beverly Hills, Alexander Stone married Victoria Matthews for the second time. The ceremony took place in the garden of their home, surrounded by close friends, family, and colleagues who had watched their love story unfold. Emma, now 8 years old and completely recovered from her surgery, served as maid of honor, wearing a pale pink dress and beaming with pride as she carried Victoria's bouquet. Alexander's best man was Dr. James Chen, Dr. Sarah Chen's husband, who had become a close friend during Emma's recovery. Victoria walked down the aisle not to impress anyone, but because she was genuinely excited to marry the man who had proven himself worthy of her love and trust. Alexander waited for her at the altar with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had overcome to reach this moment. Dearly beloved, the officiant began, we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Alexander and Victoria, and to celebrate not just their love for each other, but the beautiful family they've created together. The ceremony was personal and meaningful, filled with references to second chances, the importance of family, and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. When they exchanged vows, both Alexander and Victoria spoke not just to each other, but to Emma, promising to love and protect their family forever. I promise to put our family first, always, Alexander said, looking directly at Victoria. I promise to be the husband you deserve and the father Emma needs. I promise that no business deal, no matter how important, will ever come before the people I love. Victoria's vows were equally heartfelt. I promise to trust you with our hearts, she said. "I promise to communicate openly and honestly, to work with you as a true partner in all things. I promise to believe in the man you've become and the family we're building together." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was thunderous. Emma cheered loudest of all, throwing flower petals in the air and dancing around the newlyweds. At the reception, Alexander gave a speech that surprised many of his business associates with its emotional honesty. 7 years ago, I thought success meant building the biggest company, making the most money, winning every deal, he said, looking out at the gathered crowd. I was wrong. Real success is sitting here today with my beautiful wife and amazing daughter, knowing that I'm the luckiest man alive because they chose to love me despite all my flaws. He raised his champagne glass. To Victoria, who never gave up on the possibility of second chances. To Emma, who taught me what unconditional love really means. And to all of you, who believed in us even when we weren't sure we believed in ourselves. As the sun set over Beverly Hills and the party continued into the night, Alexander danced with his wife and daughter, marveling at how different this celebration felt from their first wedding. That had been about showing off, about impressing others with their success and status. This was about joy, about love, about a family that had been tested and emerged stronger. "No regrets?" Victoria asked as they swayed together to their favorite song. Alexander looked over at Emma, who was showing off her dance moves to anyone who would watch, and then back at his beautiful wife. "Only one," he said. Victoria raised an eyebrow in concern. "I regret that it took me 7 years to realize what was most important," Alexander said, "but I'm grateful every day that you gave me the chance to make it right." As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Alexander, Victoria, and Emma sat together on the porch swing, still dressed in their wedding finery, watching the stars appear in the clear California sky. "Best day ever," Emma declared sleepily, curled up between her parents. "Best day ever," Victoria agreed, resting her head on Alexander's shoulder. Alexander wrapped his arms around his family and silently agreed. He had built a billion-dollar empire, achieved everything he'd once thought he wanted, but nothing compared to this moment of perfect contentment. "I love you both," he whispered into the quiet night. "We love you too, Daddy," Emma murmured, already half asleep. As Alexander carried his daughter inside and tucked her into bed, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Sometimes the most valuable things in life were the ones you didn't know you were looking for. Sometimes the greatest success came not from what you built, but from what you were brave enough to rebuild. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got a second chance to get it right. The broken coffee mug had been replaced long ago, but Alexander kept one piece of it on his desk at work, a small fragment with the faded words, "World's Best Husband," still visible. It served as a daily reminder that the most important job he'd ever have wasn't CEO of Stone Technologies. It was being Victoria's husband and Emma's father, and this time he was determined to be the best at both. What did you think of Alexander and Victoria's story? Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.